Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name is Beth Cohen and today we'll be talking about the Amnesty Law 1 year on. A year after it came into effect, the amnesty law related to Catalonia's independence push has been validated by the Constitutional Court. Whilst the pardon of over 300 activists and officials has eased tensions, the cases of many high-profile leaders are unresolved and its long-term impact remains unclear. This week on Filling the Sink, we'll be discussing this controversial piece of legislation. And I'm joined today to do so by Gerard Escaich Folch. Hello, Gerard.
Hi, Beth. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Happy Monday.
Yeah, exactly. We're publishing this a little bit earlier than usual.
Ahead of time because it's a hot topic. So, Gerard, before we get into detail, can you give us a brief overview of what the amnesty law is?
Well, the amnesty law was passed in Congress, in the Spanish Congress, last May 2024, and it relates to all Catalan independence push events going from November 2011 to November 2023. It came into effect on June 11th, 2024, and so far it has benefited, or around 300 individuals have been granted an amnesty because of their involvement in the 2014 and 2017 Catalan independence referendums.
So what does the law cover?
Well, it covers a wide range of aspects from political to administrative acts aimed at the Catalan secession, and it includes also protesters and even those who were trying to stop protests in favor of Catalan independence, so for example, police officers. However, it excludes crimes involving serious violence or torture, as well as embezzlement or misuse of public funds and terrorism conviction. Those who were charged with terrorism don't get to be granted an amnesty.
And we'll be hearing more about terrorism later, as well as embezzlement, as because of this reason some high-profile figures haven't been granted amnesty. So, Gerard, this law only applies to a specific period in history during the independence push, right?
Yeah, exactly, Beth. It goes from November 2011, when the first movements to plan the 2014 self-determination non-binding referendum started, until November 2023, so after the 2017 independence referendum. And that's the date that, for example, Esquerra Republicana, a Catalan pro-independence party, and even Junts per Catalunya, another Catalan pro-independence party, reached a deal with the socialists to see Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez being re-elected back in November 2023 after Spanish elections. And that's when they agreed, both parties, with the socialists to start planning and to propose an amnesty law on all Catalan independence push-related events.
Mm-hmm. And the impact of the law so far has been mixed. What's happened during this year and what hasn't?
Well, there are some things that have happened. For example, 328 people have benefited or have been granted an amnesty out of the, for example, 480 expected by the public prosecutor in Spain, or out of the over 880 by the Catalan Òmnium Cultural, which is a civil society group. So they were numbers of who could benefit from the amnesty law from the first day or even before it was passed. But so far, over 380 people have benefited of it. However, one of the major figures who hasn't benefited, as you mentioned, top politicians include former President Carles Puigdemont, who at the moment is still residing in Belgium after leaving Spain in 2017 and making a short appearance in August 2024. But Carles Puigdemont is one of the main figures who's still waiting on his future to see if the amnesty law is granted or not.
Mm-hmm. And the reason that we're talking about the amnesty law now is that it's recently been upheld in the Constitutional Court.
Yeah, exactly. The Constitutional Court of Spain decided on the appeal on constitutionality by the People's Party, the major opposition party in Spanish Congress, on June 26, on Thursday, June 26, with 6 magistrates in favor and 4 against it. So the progressive magistrates that we say, those more left-wing, voted in favor of the amnesty law and deeming that the law was constitutional, something that the People's Party were appealing the court to see if it was constitutional or not. So they had been debating for 4 days, and the outcome was on Thursday, 26.
And why was the law's constitutionality in doubt?
Well, one of the things that the People's Party was questioning is if the law was constitutional based on the Spanish Constitution passed in 1978 here in Spain after Franco's dictatorship finished. But one of the things that the Constitutional Court said is that even though it's not listed in the Constitution or the amnesty is not mentioned in the Constitution, that doesn't mean it's not unconstitutional.
To find out more, we spoke with Josep Lluís Martí, professor in the Faculty of Law at Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Let's hear that interview.
So the most important part of the ruling is that the Constitutional Court in Spain has declared that this law, the amnesty law, is fully constitutional, with just a few exceptions of some particular articles, some sections of the law that are not actually central. So basically the amnesty law is fully respectful of the Spanish Constitution. That's the main argument. And the main reason is that so the Constitutional Court declares that the Constitution doesn't prohibit, doesn't reject the possibility that parliaments can pass a law establishing an amnesty. So given that the Constitution doesn't prohibit it, then we should understand that it's permitted, right? So it's permitted for parliaments to pass this if they consider that there are some exceptional circumstances that might justify such an exceptional law that is such as an amnesty law. That's the main, the baseline of the ruling. And then, yes, there are some exceptions, some articles that basically for technicalities they have been declared unconstitutional, or they have been interpreted to fit with the constitutional legality. But the main part of the ruling, basically, as we were expecting, and this has not been a surprise, has been that the amnesty law is fully constitutional.
Thank you to Josep Lluís Martí for speaking with us. We'll be hearing more of that interview later. So Gerard, Josep Lluís said that the ruling didn't come as a surprise.
Exactly, because earlier, before the debate started, a month earlier, one of the magistrates who was in charge of presenting the amnesty law appeal, or like the talk on the appeal to the other magistrates, was already preparing a document or a report. And the report said that the amnesty law was in fact binding to the Spanish Constitution. So obviously it didn't come at a surprise. However, the Constitutional Court is not the only one talking about the amnesty law, because many other courts across Spain are giving their take on it, including the Spanish Supreme Court, which is at the moment the one that's saying that, for example, the misuse of public fund charges are not part of the amnesty deal. So the people who have been accused of embezzlement cannot benefit or cannot be granted an amnesty. And that applies to former President Carles Puigdemont, or also former Vice President Oriol Junqueras, who are still waiting on the courts to say if embezzlement is part of the amnesty or not.
And who are the high-profile figures who could be affected? I mean, you've mentioned Oriol Junqueras, Carles Puigdemont. Who else could be affected?
So, aside from Oriol Junqueras, the current president of Esquerra Republicana, and the former Catalan president Carles Puigdemont, people who have not been granted an amnesty because of the misuse of public funds include Jordi Turull or Dolors Bassa. Those who, however, have been benefit of the disobedience charges that they had been charged with because of the amnesty law.
And Josep Lluís mentioned 3 exceptions to the amnesty law. Can you give us a bit more detail?
Yeah, exactly. Even though the Constitutional Court said that the amnesty law was binding by the Spanish Constitution, it accepted 3 exceptions that the People's Party were raising or were appealing. One of them was that the law must include people who protested against the Catalan independence process. So that's one of the challenges or one of the challenge points by the People's Party that the Constitutional Court agrees with. But judges also said that the law should be limited to events occurring between November 2011 and November 2023, so it could not be extended into the future because obviously an amnesty is granted to those who had been facing charges in the past and not for perpetuity in the future. So it had to be limited in a time frame. And the last challenge point was that the Court of Auditors in Spain, who takes care of supervising all the used public funding, had to be heard a private accusation before being able to close any cases.
So in summary, it must be retrospective, only to do with events in the past. It must be to do with the Catalan independence process, and they must listen to all private accusations. Are the 3 exceptions.
Exactly.
We asked Josep Lluís Martí to clarify the legal context of the law's implementation. Let's hear his reply.
We should remember that this puts a contrast with previous rulings by the Supreme Court. So in Spain, we have two highest courts, the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Court. Constitutional Court is basically its competence, its power is the final interpreter of the Constitution and the final guardian of the Constitution. So it's basically the authority that has this ultimate power to decide whether laws passed by parliaments are or are not constitutional. The Supreme Court doesn't have this power, but in previous rulings, the Supreme Court had declared that according to them, this law was unconstitutional. So it's not only Partido Popular, the right-wing party in Spain, who thought that the amnesty law was unconstitutional, but also important courts in Spain had been saying so. And now the Constitutional Court says, with no doubt, with clarity and in a well-structured ruling, 205 pages, very detailed, they have said this law is fully constitutional.
One of the main problems that people have been accused of during this pro-independence push is about terrorism and misuse of public funds. Those are some key elements that are not tackled in this statement or in this ruling. Why so?
So the main reason is that in the appeal presented by Partido Popular, they didn't focus on these issues. They said that at this respect, what they thought is that the amnesty law was too general, too little specific, and that could violate the principle of legality. So according to the Constitutional Court, that's not the case. So they were not asked to say whether they thought, particularly if the misuse of public funds that might have been committed by some Catalan leaders, they were not asked to say anything about that. All what the Constitutional Court says is that the amnesty law, when they exclude these two crimes, among others, terrorism and the misuse of public funds, it does it well. And yes, it's a little bit general, but all laws are general. All laws might be more specific, more detailed, but that's not sufficient reason actually to declare these articles unconstitutional.
That's a very valid point that Josep Lluís makes. So Gerard, according to the Constitutional Court, the amnesty law doesn't violate European legislation on terrorism.
Yeah, exactly. The ruling of over 200 pages, this ruling by the Constitutional Court says that it's in favor of all the amnesty law, and it considers that the amnesty, it also applies to terrorism charges. However, people who are facing those charges have not had to infringe human rights, so to be granted an amnesty. So if it doesn't infringe human rights, it doesn't violate neither the Constitution, neither the Spanish Constitution, nor the European legislation. That's what the ruling of the Constitutional Court says. And one of the other things that we were waiting for is the misuse of public funds. And if Carles Puigdemont, for example, could benefit of this amnesty law now that the Constitutional Court has ruled in favor of it, and the answer is no, not yet, to be precise. Why? Because, as we mentioned, the Constitutional Court ruled on the appeal by the People's Party, appeal on constitutionality of the law. However, the People's Party didn't talk about misuse of public funds or embezzlement, so that's something that the Constitutional Court did not have to position themselves yet. They would be able to position themselves in the future because Carles Puigdemont will appeal his rejection of being granted an amnesty by the Supreme Court. So his next step is to appeal to the Constitutional Court. So in the next months, we don't know how many, we'll be able to know if the amnesty law also applies to charges of misuse of public funds or not.
To find out more about the specific case of Carles Puigdemont, let's hear from Josep Lluís Martí.
So we need to remember that the particular case of Carles Puigdemont, the former president of Catalonia, and other independentist leaders, so this depends from a previous ruling from the Supreme Court, the Spanish Supreme Court, not the Constitutional Court, but the Supreme Court. Now, in these previous rulings, what the Supreme Court said is that even if they thought, they were convinced that the amnesty law was unconstitutional, they said even if finally the Constitutional Court declares that it's constitutional, it should not be applicable to the case of Carles Puigdemont and others, because the law explicitly excludes crimes like misuse of public funds. So according to the Supreme Court, Carles Puigdemont and others, they could not benefit from the amnesty law because they, according to the Supreme Court, they committed these crimes of, among others, misuse of public funds. This is the context. Now, the Constitutional Court could not They could not say anything about this particular case, which just last week the Supreme Court put a final end, which opened the door for the attorneys defending Carles Puigdemont and the others to present an appeal to the Constitutional Court. Because if they are convinced that they should benefit from the amnesty law, they might claim that the Supreme Court has deprived them from this benefit and thus has violated their fundamental rights. They can do so in the next few weeks, and then once they do that, then the Spanish Constitutional Court will have the capacity to say something about the particular case. That's not the case now, so we need to wait to see whether the Constitutional Court really thinks that the amnesty law is applicable to these cases or not. It might be that in the end they consider that it's not, so this is something we don't know yet. But even if they say that they should benefit from the application of the amnesty law, this is not the end of the story. So the Constitutional Court, once they say so, if they say so, the legal case will return to the Supreme Court, and it will be the Supreme Court the one having the last word about this particular case. So this can be a very long story yet. And now the Constitutional Court was not allowed actually to say something about this specific case.
Thank you, Josep Lluís Martí, for speaking with us. So, Gerard, what's the general reaction been to the law? For example, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez was initially a promoter of the law as it was part of a deal to re-elect him.
Well, in fact, Pedro Sánchez said that it was wonderful news for Spain, and he was very satisfied because his cabinet has always said that a law passed by Congress would be constitutional, and after the Constitutional Court ruled in favor, he said that it's now confirmed, and that the amnesty law has helped transform a difficult moment or a difficult conflict in Spain, mentioning or referring to the Catalan independence push, and lever for transformation, and the amnesty law has also helped into a contribution to its resolution. Mm-hmm. And however, even though Spanish Prime Minister said it was wonderful news, opposition leader or People's Party leader Alberto Núñez Feijóo said that it was an illegal transaction. In fact, he said that it was shameful for any democracy, regardless of what a divided constitutional court said, especially because it was voted by 6 people in favor and 4 magistrates against. And Feijóo also said that it was an amnesty which was illegal, immoral, and a corrupt transaction of power just to see Pedro Sánchez being re-elected, and an attack against the separation of powers.
Okay, so we've talked about the reaction of the Spanish government. What has been the reaction of Catalan politicians?
Well, for example, Catalan president, who is also from the Socialist Party, such as Pedro Sánchez, Salvador Illa said that the amnesty law has worked, and I'm quoting him, and that it had benefited over 300 people, and that, as he said, things in Catalonia are much better, and that the vote from the Constitutional Court makes a turning point towards the full normality of a plural society. That's what he said. But he also urgently asked that the law was enforced, referring to the Supreme Court, who is still deciding on the misuse of public funds, and ruled that the amnesty was not going to be implemented into these charges, while Esquerra Republicana, the pro-independence party, one of the parties that reached a deal with the socialists to see to see the amnesty becoming into a law, said that it was a success for democracy and for the pro-independence movement, and that it was time to comply, while Junts, the other main pro-independence party, which also struck a similar tone, said that the law is not being fully implemented because of the rebellion of many sectors of the judiciary. And Gerard, for example, his Secretary General, said that the Supreme Court is against the legislative branch, referring that the law was passed in Congress with an absolute majority, with several parties voting in favor of the amnesty law, and now it has been upheld by the Constitutional Court.
The amnesty law may have eased political tensions in the short term, but its long-term future is uncertain, and its impact on Catalonia's independence movement and Spanish unity will likely remain a contentious issue in upcoming elections. It's time now for our Catalan phrase of the week. Gerard, what do we have?
So this week we have el més calent és a l'aigüera. It's kind of a difficult one, this one.
Yeah, the hottest thing is in the sink. Now, I just want to pull you up on this. Aigüera and pica both mean sink in Catalan, right?
Yeah, that's exactly the literal translation, but we could say it's something, it's still up in the air. and mainly you will use el més calent és a l'aigüera to describe a situation that is far from being resolved or completed, despite appearances or expectations. Similar like the Amnesty Law, it's often used with a sense of frustration or impatience.
This week on Filling the Sink, we've been talking about the Amnesty Law 1 year on. Thank you, Josep Lluís Martí, for speaking with us, and thank you to you, Gerard, for joining me here in the studio.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. We're publishing this week's podcast ahead of time, and we'll be back on Saturday the 12th of July with another exciting episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of all the team here at Catalan News, I'm Beth Cohen, wishing you a fantastic week. Fins aviat. Adeu.